The Younger Dryas cold event was a sudden climatic reversal that occurred approximately 12,900 years ago, bringing an abrupt return to near glacial conditions after a period of warming at the end of the last ice age. This event, which lasted around 1200 years, saw temperatures drop dramatically, specifically in the northern hemisphere, disrupting ecosystems, altering rainfall patterns, and drastically affecting early human populations who were just beginning to evolve from hunter-gatherer societies. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated, but the most widely accepted theory involves a massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic, likely from the sudden release of meltwater from the Laurentide ice sheet. This influx would have disrupted the system of ocean currents that distributes warm water across the globe, effectively shutting down heat transport and plunging large parts of the world back into cold, dry conditions. For the average human living during the Younger Dryas, this period would have been nothing short of a nightmare. Communities that had adapted to the relatively stable, warming climate of the early Holocene were suddenly thrown into a world of extreme cold, drought, and ecological collapse. In many areas, plant life that had been flourishing died off, leaving animals without sufficient food and forcing humans to relocate. Starvation, malnutrition, and resource competition would have been constant threats. As people migrated in search of food in more hospitable environments, conflicts likely arose between groups fighting for dwindling resources. Shelter would have also been a major concern, as humans had to adapt to colder temperatures with more effective clothing and increased reliance on fire. The Younger Dryas finally ended around 11,700 years ago, marking the return to warmer, more stable conditions. With the sudden warming, ecosystems recovered, agriculture became more viable, and human populations were able to settle into more permanent communities, laying the groundwork for the first true civilizations. In many ways, the end of the Younger Dryas was a turning point, as the hardships faced during this period may have accelerated human innovation. However, for those who had lived through it, the Younger Dryas would have been a time of immense suffering, uncertainty, and struggle, making it one of the harshest periods in human prehistory. The Bronze Age collapse, occurring between roughly 1200 to 1150 BC, saw the sudden collapse of some of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, including the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the New Kingdom of Egypt, and the cities of the Levant such as Ugarit. Trade networks that had flourished for centuries disintegrated, cities were abandoned or destroyed, writing systems vanished, and populations declined. The causes of the collapse remain debated, but a combination of factors likely played a role. Climate change, possibly in the form of prolonged droughts, may have led to widespread famine, weakening states and making them vulnerable to invasion and internal strife. Earthquakes may have further devastated certain areas, while economic instability, caused by the breakdown of international trade, left once thriving civilizations unable to sustain themselves. One of the most infamous causes was the arrival of the so-called Sea Peoples, which were mysterious groups of raiders and migrants who swept across the eastern Mediterranean, attacking and destroying cities. Farmers who had once relied on state-supported irrigation and protection from raiders suddenly found themselves alone as governments crumbled. Crops failed, either due to drought or because fields were left untended. Famine was widespread, with entire communities forcing to abandon their homes in search of food, only to find themselves competing with other desperate refugees. In cities, once thriving markets turned into battlegrounds as trade disappeared, and without centralized control, law and order broke down, with piracy, banditry, and local warfare becoming rampant. Survivors faced difficult choices: either flee to remote areas, attempt to integrate into new societies, or fight for their survival in increasingly violent conditions. The loss of writing systems in many regions meant that knowledge was lost, and generations that followed had to rebuild without the tools and cultural records of their predecessors. It was a world where survival became the only priority, and luxuries, education, and artistic achievements faded in importance. Many once great cities never recovered, and the world that followed was drastically different from the one that had came before. While new powers such as the Neo-Assyrians, Phoenicians, and early Greeks eventually rose from the ruins, for those who had lived through this collapse, it had been one of the darkest periods in human history. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from the late 8th to early 11th centuries, was a period of frequent and brutal raids by the Norse Vikings taking place across Europe. Beginning with the infamous sacking of the Lindisfarne Monastery in 793, Viking raids targeted coastal settlements, churches, and trade centers from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. These attacks were driven by a combination of factors, including population pressure in Scandinavia, political instability, and the lure of wealth. Coastal villages, which were often poorly defended, were particularly vulnerable. The Vikings would appear without warning, with their longships gliding silently through the fog before warriors stormed ashore, setting buildings ablaze, looting treasures, and killing or enslaving those they captured. A peaceful morning could turn into a massacre within minutes. Farmers and fishermen who had once lived relatively stable lives now faced the constant threat of destruction, and even those who survived an attack often lost everything, forced to rebuild with little hope that the raiders would not return. Religious communities suffered greatly, as monasteries were rich targets, filled with gold and silver objects, yet they were manned by monks with no means of defending themselves. Many were slaughtered, while others were taken as slaves. Entire regions became depopulated as people fled inland, abandoning their homes in fear. Trade routes were disrupted, and local economies collapsed as commerce became too dangerous to conduct. For many, the only option was to submit to stronger rulers who could offer protection, leading to the rise of fortified settlements and the centralization of power in many regions. The Viking raids began to decline in the 11th century due to several factors. Many Norsemen settled in the lands they had once pillaged, becoming rulers rather than raiders, and stronger defenses, including stone castles and organized military responses, made raids more difficult. Additionally, the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity led to cultural shifts that discouraged large-scale raiding. By the mid-11th century, the Viking Age had effectively ended, and while some areas recovered and flourished under new rulers, others did not. The Viking Age had reshaped Europe, creating new political landscapes, but for those who had lived through it, it had been a time of immense fear and hardship. The Mongol invasions, taking place in the 13th and 14th centuries, were among the most destructive military campaigns in history. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols expanded from the steppes of Central Asia to conquer vast territories, including China, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and parts of South Asia. Their military success was due to superior cavalry tactics, expert archery, psychological warfare, and an unparalleled ability to adapt to different combat environments. Entire cities were obliterated, with their populations massacred or enslaved. Those who resisted were met with brutal retribution, with there being accounts describing pyramids of skulls left as warnings to others. Even surrender did not always guarantee safety, as cities that opened their gates were sometimes spared, but others were still plundered, with their inhabitants being enslaved or executed. The scale of destruction was unparalleled, with places like Baghdad, once a thriving center of learning and culture, reduced to ruins. The loss of irrigation systems, libraries, and infrastructure meant that recovery for many regions took centuries. The suffering of ordinary people extended beyond the battlefield, as refugees fled in all directions, overwhelming other settlements and leading to further conflict over resources. Food shortages were common, as farms were burned, livestock stolen, and irrigation systems destroyed. Disease also spread rapidly, with some historians linking the Mongol expansion to the spread of the Black Death. Survivors often had to endure forced labor under Mongol rule, with artisans, engineers, and skilled workers taking to serve in different parts of the empire. The Mongol invasions gradually came to an end in the late 14th century as the empire fragmented due to internal struggles, overextension, and the resilience of local populations. While the initial period was marked by immense destruction, the Mongol Empire did bring certain long-term benefits, such as increased trade along the Silk Road and cultural exchanges between East and West. However, for those who had lived through the invasions, it had been one of the darkest times in history, being an era of relentless war and suffering. While some regions eventually recovered and prospered under Mongol rule, others remained scarred by the devastation for generations. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, ravaged Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people. The disease was primarily spread by fleas that infested rats, but human-to-human transmission also contributed to its rapid spread. The outbreak likely began in Central Asia and traveled along trade routes, reaching Europe through merchant ships arriving in Sicily. Once it arrived, the plague spread with terrifying speed, devastating both cities and rural communities. The disease struck suddenly, with victims developing fevers, chills, vomiting, and painful swollen lymph nodes. In many cases, death followed within days. Entire households perished, and streets were filled with the stench of rotting corpses as burial services could not keep up. Mass graves became common, with bodies piled on top of one another in hurried attempts to contain the spread. Fear and panic spread across communities, and people often abandoned their sick relatives, fleeing in the hope of escaping infection. Doctors were powerless, relying on ineffective treatments such as bloodletting, herbal remedies, or religious rituals. Trade and agriculture collapsed as farmers and merchants succumbed to the disease, and in towns, businesses shut down, with once thriving marketplaces being completely empty. Law and order disintegrated, with crime and social unrest increasing as desperate survivors scavenged for food and supplies. Many turned to religion for answers, believing the plague to be divine punishment, and some formed gatherings, whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins, while others blamed marginalized groups, leading to violent slaughters, particularly against Jewish communities. The Black Death finally came to an end by the early 1350s, though outbreaks would continue sporadically for centuries. With so much of the population dead, labor shortages led to higher wages for peasants, weakening the feudal system and ultimately contributing to the decline of medieval society. Some regions recovered and even prospered, but for those who had lived through it, the Black Death had been a period of unimaginable horror. It shattered families, devastated economies, and left deep psychological scars, making it one of the worst periods to be alive in human history. The Little Ice Age famine was a period of extreme hardship caused by a prolonged cooling of the climate between the 14th and 19th centuries. While the Little Ice Age itself spanned several centuries, some of its worst famines occurred in the 14th and 17th centuries, specifically in Europe. Cooler temperatures, unpredictable weather patterns, and excessive rainfall led to widespread crop failures, food shortages, and mass starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the earliest and most devastating examples, striking much of northern Europe and leaving millions struggling to survive. For the average person, life during these famines was miserable and uncertain. Farmers, who relied on unpredictable growing seasons, saw their fields turn to mud from relentless rains or freeze before crops could mature. Grain harvests failed year after year, leading to soaring food prices. Starving families were forced to eat whatever they could find, including dogs, cats, tree bark, and even clay in desperation. Many resorted to scavenging in the forest for roots and berries, while others were reduced to eating spoiled or moldy food, leading to outbreaks of disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and the plague. In cities, the situations were just as dire, as crime rates soared, with desperate individuals looting grain stores and attacking food shipments. Governments attempted to regulate prices and prevent hoarding, but corruption and inefficiency meant that relief rarely reached those who needed it most. And cannibalism was even reported in some areas. Social unrest followed, with peasants revolting against landlords and authorities, who were perceived as hoarding food while the masses perished. The famines caused by the Little Ice Age gradually subsided as agriculture adapted to new conditions and societies developed better food storage and transportation systems. However, recovery was slow and the long-term effects were severe. Entire villages were abandoned and populations declined, and some areas did eventually benefit from agricultural advancements, but for those who had lived through the worst years, it had been a time of unimaginable suffering. The Columbian Exchange, which began in 1492 with Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas, was the widespread transfer of plants, animals, people, diseases, and ideas between the Old World, which consisted of Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, which was the Americas. This exchange reshaped societies on both sides of the Atlantic, bringing new foods, economic opportunities, and cultural interactions. However, for many people, especially indigenous populations in the Americas, it was a period of immense suffering marked by disease, conquest, slavery, and environmental destruction. For the average indigenous person, the Columbian Exchange was catastrophic. European explorers and settlers unknowingly introduced deadly disease such as smallpox, measles, and influenza to populations with no prior exposure or immunity. These diseases spread rapidly, killing millions, and some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas perished within a century. Entire civilizations, such as the Aztecs and the Incas, crumbled under the weight of disease, warfare, and forced labor. Survivors faced enslavement, displacement, and cultural destruction as European powers seized land and imposed their own religions and governments. Meanwhile, African populations also suffered greatly as European demand for labor in the Americas led to the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, enduring horrific conditions on slave ships before being sold into brutal labor systems on plantations growing sugar, tobacco, and cotton. For the enslaved, daily life meant back-breaking work, physical abuse, and a complete loss of freedom. Families were torn apart, and entire societies in Africa were destabilized due to the constant warfare and raids fueled by the demand for slaves. Even in Europe, where new crops such as potatoes eventually improved nutrition and population growth, the early effects of the exchange were not always positive. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas contributed to economic instability and inflation, making life harder for peasants. Additionally, colonial wars and conflicts over resources led to widespread violence and suffering. The Columbian Exchange never truly ended, as global trade and cultural interactions continued to evolve. While some long-term effects, such as agricultural diversity and economic expansion, benefited future generations, the immediate impact was devastating for millions. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. What began as a religious war between Catholic and Protestant slaves in the Holy Roman Empire quickly escalated into a broader struggle involving nearly every major European power. Fueled by political ambitions, territorial disputes, and shifting alliances, the war devastated Central Europe, particularly the German states, leading to massive population loss, economic collapse, and widespread suffering. Armies, both foreign and domestic, roamed the countryside, pillaging villages, burning homes, and massacring civilians. Soldiers, many of whom were poorly paid mercenaries, survived by looting and terrorizing the local population. No town or village was truly safe, as shifting battle lines meant that once secure areas could suddenly become war zones. Ordinary people often had no choices but to flee, abandoning their farms and possessions to avoid the brutality of the warring factions. Famine and disease were just as deadly as the battles themselves. The constant movement of troops disrupted agriculture, making it nearly impossible for peasants to plant or harvest crops. Food shortages led to extremely high prices, forcing many into starvation. Desperate people resorted to eating grass, roots, or even the flesh of the dead in some of the worst affected regions. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making communities more vulnerable to outbreaks of disease, and social order collapsed as governments struggled to maintain control. Lawlessness became widespread, with bandits and deserters preying on civilians. Women were particularly vulnerable, often facing assault or being taken as war spoils by soldiers. Many families were torn apart, with children orphaned or sold into servitude, and entire villages disappeared, either destroyed by war or abandoned by survivors seeking refuge in overcrowded, disease-ridden cities. The war finally ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which redrew political boundaries and established principles of state sovereignty. While the treaties brought an end to large-scale fighting, much of Europe, especially Germany, was left in ruins. Recovery was slow, taking generations to rebuild the economy and restore stability. The Irish potato famine, also known as the Great Hunger, occurred between 1845 and 1852, and it was one of the most devastating humanitarian disasters in history. It was caused by a potato blight that spread rapidly through Ireland's potato crops, leading to widespread starvation and death. The famine was worsened by British policies, economic exploitation, and a lack of meaningful relief efforts, making it not just a natural disaster, but a social and political catastrophe. For the average Irish person, specifically peasants who depended almost entirely on potatoes for subsistence, the famine was a nightmare. The blight turned healthy potatoes into inedible blackened mush, and with little to eat, families began to starve. Weak from hunger, people resorted to eating grass, seaweed, and even tree bark in desperate attempts to survive. Many died with green stains around their mouths from trying to eat anything that might provide nourishment. Disease, including typhus, dysentery, and cholera, spread rapidly in starving communities, killing those who might have otherwise survived. Evictions became rampant as landlords, many of whom were English, forced poor tenants from their homes when they could no longer pay rent. Entire families were thrown onto the roads, with no shelter from the harsh Irish winters. Workhouses, meant to provide relief, became overcrowded and disease-ridden death traps. Those unable to find aid in the workhouses often collapsed and died on the roadside. Immigration became the only hope for many, but that was also a horrible situation in itself. The ships were overcrowded and poorly maintained, with thousands dying at sea due to malnutrition, disease, and overall terrible conditions. Those who made it to places like the United States or Canada often faced discrimination and extreme poverty, but it was still preferable to staying in Ireland where death seemed certain. The famine finally ended in the early 1850s as the potato blight receded and food became more available, but the damage was irreversible. Over 1 million people had died and another 1 million had immigrated, permanently altering Ireland's demographic and cultural landscape. The famine deepened Irish resentment towards British rule and fueled nationalist movements. Though Ireland would eventually recover, for those who had lived through the famine, it had been one of the worst periods in history. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864, was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. It began as a religious and political uprising against the ruling Qing dynasty, led by Hong Xiuquan, a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hong and his followers sought to establish the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, a society based on land redistribution, social equality, and a rejection of traditional Chinese beliefs. What began as a small rebellion in southern China quickly grew into a massive civil war, resulting in an estimated 20 to 30 million deaths. The war brought widespread devastation, as both Taiping and Qing forces waged brutal campaigns, leaving cities and villages in ruins. Entire communities were massacred, and civilians were often caught between the two warring factions. Taiping forces would seize towns, forcibly enlisting men into their armies and imposing strict religious and social reforms. Meanwhile, Qing forces retaliated, destroying farmland and slaughtering entire populations suspected of supporting the rebels. Starvation became one of the greatest threats to the common people, and the destruction of agricultural land combined with mass displacement led to widespread famine. Those who could no longer find food resorted to eating grass, leaves, or even human flesh to stay alive. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded refugee camps and war-torn cities, killing thousands. Families were torn apart as men were taken as soldiers, women were subjected to violence, and children were left orphaned. Many civilians, desperate to escape the horrors of war, attempted to flee to safer regions, only to be met with more chaos. The rebellion finally ended in 1864 with the fall of the Taiping capital, Nanjing, after a brutal siege by Qing forces with foreign support. Hong Xiuquan had already died, and his movement collapsed soon after. Though the Qing dynasty survived, it was severely weakened and China remained unstable for decades. The suffering caused by the war left deep scars on the population, and the scale of destruction made recovery slow and painful. While some reforms were later adopted, the rebellion had brought misery to millions, making it one of the worst times to be alive in Chinese history. The Holodomor was a devastating man-made famine that occurred in Soviet Ukraine in the year 1932, resulting in the deaths of millions of people. It was caused by the policies of Joseph Stalin's government, particularly forced collectivization and grain requisition quotas that stripped Ukrainian peasants of their food supply. While the Soviet authorities denied it at the time, many historians consider the Holodomor an act of genocide as it targeted Ukrainians and aimed to crush resistance to Soviet rule. The Soviet government demanded impossible grain quotas from Ukrainian villages, often confiscating not just surplus grain, but also essential food supplies. Armed Soviet agents raided homes, taking everything edible, such as wheat, vegetables, livestock, and even seeds for the next planting season. Those caught hiding food faced brutal punishment, including exile to labor camps or execution. As a result, entire communities were left with nothing to eat. In the early months, families tried to survive on whatever scraps they could find, and people ate tree bark, grass, roots, and rodents. As hunger worsened, some turned to eating leather, straw, or dirt in a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs. Children and the elderly died first due to them being the weakest, and disease spread rapidly among the starving population, with typhus and dysentery killing those whose bodies had already wasted away. Reports of cannibalism surfaced, and mothers watched their children starve. Soviet authorities deliberately blocked outside aid and travel, ensuring that the starving population had no escape, and entire villages were reduced to skeletal figures waiting for death. Borders were closed, and those who attempted to flee were either sent back to die or shot on sight. Despite the suffering, any discussion of famine was strictly forbidden, and Soviet propaganda continued to claim record grain harvests. The Holodomor ended in 1933 as grain requisitions eased, but by then, millions had perished. The famine left deep scars on Ukraine, both in terms of population loss and cultural trauma. The Soviet Union continued to suppress knowledge of the famine for decades, and it was only after Ukraine gained independence in 1991 that the full extent of the tragedy was openly acknowledged. While the famine ended, its impact shaped Ukrainian history, fueling long-standing resentment towards Soviet rule and deepening national identity. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, which took place from 1958 to 1962, was one of the most devastating periods in modern Chinese history. This campaign was an ambitious attempt to rapidly transform China's agrarian economy into an industrialized socialist society. Mao sought to increase agricultural and industrial output through collectivization and mass mobilization, believing that human effort could overcome technological and infrastructural limitations. However, the policies implemented were deeply flawed and led to one of the deadliest famines in human history, leaving millions of people to suffer extreme hardship, starvation, and death. One of the most significant changes was the forced collectivization of agriculture, in which private farming was abolished and people were organized into large communal farms. These communes imposed strict work schedules, often requiring peasants to labor for long hours with little rest. The government set unattainable production quotas, and in an effort to meet them, local officials often exaggerated their output figures. This led to the state confiscating massive amounts of grain, believing there was surplus, while in reality, the people were left with almost nothing to eat. Even worse, Mao discouraged criticism of his policies, and officials who reported food shortages risked being labeled as traitors or counter-revolutionaries. As a result, the true extent of the famine was hidden from the leadership, worsening the crisis. People resorted to eating tree bark, leaves, and even soil in desperate attempts to stay alive, and some were forced into cannibalism, eating the flesh of the dead or even their own family members. Disease spread rapidly due to malnutrition, and since many doctors had been persecuted, medical care was scarce. The Iron and Steel Production Initiative was another catastrophic failure, as millions of farmers were ordered to abandon their fields to work in backyard furnaces, melting down household metal objects to produce steel. The result was low-quality, useless metal, and the neglect of agriculture worsened food shortages. By 1962, the Great Leap Forward had clearly failed, and the policies were gradually abandoned. It is estimated that between 30 to 45 million people died due to famine, forced labor, and government repression. Mao's influence temporarily weakened, and more pragmatic leaders took steps to restore economic stability. Although conditions improved, the trauma of the Great Leap Forward left a lasting scar on Chinese society. For those who had lived through it, it was one of the most devastating and inhumane periods in modern history. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the time periods I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 2 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.